Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that made it a tradition to go camping at a certain spot every May. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area on the edge of a large lake located on government land. The lake had a dam on it, so during May the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were spaced far enough apart that you had your own privacy, but not far enough that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. The first night of our trip happened without incident. During the second day, the people staying at the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At around midnight, the people at the campsite below us were really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went down to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and he came back to inform us that he was 90% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so I just decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben and one couple that were visiting another campsite we had made friends with that day. I could hear that campsite below was still blasting their music and partying pretty hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat a blur. All I know is that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find our campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest. People were running around and screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed of what happened. Apparently, not long after I had gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up, they had encountered the couple that was with Ben walking back. Now, Derek and Ben are about the same height, and the same color hair, so they assumed that Derek was Ben, and bottled both him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One had a paring knife, and the other a butcher's knife in their hands. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them, and had barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming and came down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was over half an hour away. This is where I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of his car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until an ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness back down to their campsite and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I had gotten into his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay in the car, as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed, where they got stuck into a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Tim had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs from being hit over the head with a bottle. It was definitely the scariest thing I have ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. This happened in 2018, and I thought I should finally share this story. My fiancé and I were on the second night of our 2-night camping trip at a popular campground about a half hour from where we live. On our first night, we kept hearing noises in the woods around us. The campsite right beside ours to the right was occupied, but the one to the left was not. The campsites are about 150 yards apart, and we had camped here in the same exact plot the year before. Needless to say, we are familiar with the area and the various kinds of animals that live in the woods. First night, we heard shuffling around our tent. It was obviously something large moving around. We brushed it off and assumed it was just a deer. The next day, we spent the day at a town over with my family. They had all been invited to join us for the day by my fiancé as a surprise for me, while he proposed to me. We stayed with my family into the evening before heading back to our campsite. When we got back, things were really odd. Someone had obviously been in our tent. Our blankets were thrown around, clothes were on the floor, and my backpack had been rearranged and I was missing underwear. We were definitely spooked a little bit at first, but being only 19, we just brushed it off. So we set up a campfire and sat out until it was dark, roasting hot dogs and s'mores, smoking cigarettes, and celebrating our engagement. At around 9:30 p.m., we put out our fire and decided to go into our tent for the night. Around a half hour later, after laying in our tent, we decided to hear the noises outside our tent again. This time, we focused in. We heard clear footsteps, and at one point, a man whispering. We looked at each other, and our eyes got wide. Someone was definitely walking around outside our tent. We were still and completely silent, just listening to the footsteps. We heard whispering again. This was when we realized there were two people outside of our tent walking around whispering. Now you might think we're crazy reading this, but this was when my fiancé and I decided to get up and see what was going on outside of our tent. We got up, getting dressed. My fiancé had just turned on the light in our tent and put his binder on when a man spoke directly to us from right outside. He asked us, "What are you doing?" I can't even describe how malicious and menacing this voice sounded. It was clearly directed at us, and he said it with a snicker. He was watching us through the walls of our tent. We noticed he was on the backside of the tent. We slowly zipped open the door and decided to just run for it to the car. My fiancé grabbed his pocket knife and his keys and stepped out of the tent. He pulled me with him and we ran like hell to the car. I heard the footsteps running behind us and then turning and running up the other campsite. At the bathroom, we talked over our options. We talked about sleeping in the car or driving into the town. Then we had another idea. We drove back down to our campsite and began packing everything into the car. At this point, it was around midnight. We moved faster than I think either of us had thought possible, wrapping up the tent with our belongings still in it and grabbing our folding chairs. We were all packed in 5 minutes and hopped in the car to leave. I jumped out at the end of the camping driveway and grabbed our nameplate, which had my full name on it off the post. As we pulled out of the campsite, I saw our assailants for the first time. Stalking through the woods were two tall men. I realized that these were the same men who had been driving past our campsite the whole time we were there, just glaring at us. One was wearing camo hunting gear, and the other was wearing a Confederate flag top. Both were carrying large hunting knives, unsheathed and at the ready. They turned when they saw our car driving away, and one started to make chase until the other one stopped him. I made eye contact with the man in camo, and he smiled the most terrifyingly evil smile at me and shook his head slowly. We drove the long way home, taking all the weirdest, hardest to follow roads, and called my dad so he would know we were coming. When we got home, we told my dad everything, and he shrugged it off as us just being paranoid. I worked summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor, Mike, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. At around 9:30, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline but still in line of sight where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are shooting the shit by the water smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day. We were both gazing into the pitch black night water when we saw a small light approaching us, slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it's important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew near. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisp of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all of your children in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and she had to leave. "That's good, just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, and turned her kayak around and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only because of the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny, my kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline.